So I got my hands on not one, but two Logan Grimnars, and we're about to paint him. So we're pulling out all the stops on Logan. We're doing our best OSL yet. We're doing a custom resin pour, everything. This thing is going to be a beast. So why don't I take you through it? Let's get started. So here we're going to start on all the fur. I'm going to use a technique called wet blending, which is where you take two wet paints and blend them together so that they seamlessly move together. I have found Pro Acryl's line of paints are the best for wet blending. So we're going to take different shades of grays and browns and bring these wolves to life. So now moving on to the rock. I started with dark neutral gray for the base coat on all of the rock, and then used dark golden brown for a kind of wash, just to kind of add that earthy texture and color to the rocks. I went in with bright neutral gray as a dry brush after that, just to kind of add all of the highlights into the base. I painted all the bones and skulls using Brain Mutter Beige and Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter, and then went in with soft tone to try to give it that nice bone color and some shadows. Now we're going to start on Logan's skin. I'm going to start off with amber skin. That's going to be our base coat and serve as all of our shadow colors. After that, I'm going to mix 50-50 of amber skin and quartz skin. This is going to be our very first highlight color. This is going to go over most of the forehead, the tops of the cheeks, and the nose. Now we're going to work on our last highlight. This is going to be pure quartz skin, and this is going to go on an even smaller area. That's going to go on the tops of our forehead lines, on the tip of our nose, and on the apple of our cheeks. I'm using a brown base coat for all of the gold details. Because metallics can be really streaky, it's best to choose a base color that is in the same family and range as the metallic you are using, so that you can get a nice even application in fewer passes. Now for the base. My husband had this big idea of Logan standing on these rocks overlooking this half-frozen body of water with, you know, a body hanging out in it with its arms sticking up out of the water and bones floating around in the bottom and snow everywhere. So that's exactly what we did. We took an old 3D printed zombie from a previous project and kind of cut him in half and stuck him on the bottom so that maybe he would look like he was either chopped in half in battle or, you know, just kind of sunk into the mud a little bit and the top half of him was sticking out. We then took a couple layers of corkboard and kind of marred up the edges and made it fit on the base so that it still looked like rock and still had this really nice, interesting shoreline. We then used Armageddon dust to try to make the bottom of the lake and sink the body into what looks like mud. I then applied the same Armageddon dust to the top of the corkboard to give it some more texture, added a few skulls to the bottom of the lake bed, and then it was time to let all of this dry. I added a base coat of dark gray to the ground, some Stirland mud for the bottom of the lake, and dry brushed bright neutral gray over the top for some easy contrast and highlights. And now to glaze in some highlights on the armor and add our final edge highlights. Now it's time for the axe. I wanted this to be the biggest and brightest OSL we've ever done. My husband played around with the idea that it could be a lightning axe or something for a little bit because he wanted it to maybe match up with Njal Stormcaller and the others a little bit, but he ultimately decided to leave it as the demon-possessed axe, so we stuck with the fire theme. I used my favorite paints for creating fire and fire-like glow effects, which is the AK Interactive's Inferno and Red Creatures set. It has the best range of reds and yellows that make the most sense together and blend together really nicely. I started with a nice bright yellow for our base coat and then went in with a really, really bright yellow oil wash, which I wound up changing later because it's not quite the right color, but I wanted this to remain our hottest parts on the axe. Then I started glazing in oranges and reds, working my way out toward the edges so that the edges of the axe would look like the metal was cooler in those areas. Then I went back in with another oil wash, this time mixing yellow and white so we could get that almost white hot look into the crevices. I then take our darkest red color and blend it into the oranges so there's a nice smooth transition between the two colors, and then I repeat this whole process on the wolf heads. Then I paint the handle with leather brown, highlight it with an orange-brown color, and paint the jewel blue. Now to start on the OSL. When doing OSL, you have to remember a few things. 1, light travels in straight lines. It doesn't bend around corners. So you have to make sure that when you're placing your light, it's going directly in one line. Number 2, your cast light cannot be as bright as your brightest highlight. You have to make sure that all of the light being cast from your light source is a little bit dimmer. Number 3, your shadows need to be a little bit darker than what you think. In order to sell the effect really well, you have to make sure that there is a good contrast between the light and the dark. And number 4, light diminishes as it moves away from the light source. So as you move away from your light source, things are gonna get darker. So with those rules in mind, I'm gonna start with a darker red glaze. Now this is a little bit thicker than a regular glaze consistency. I wanted the pigment a little bit heavier so that I deposit a little bit more pigment a little bit faster. These are gonna go on all of the edges where our light is gonna hit. This is gonna be on the tops of the rocks, the top of his shoe, on the shin pad, the belt buckle, edges like that. The second part we're gonna do is we're gonna go in with the same color, but we're gonna punch up the contrast a little bit more. We're gonna take this and go on a smaller surface closer to the original light source and just glaze this in a second time. This is going to give us a nice smooth transition from where our light source is darker to where it's getting gradually brighter. Lastly, I'm going to go in with our brightest color. This is going to be kind of more of an edge highlight. These are going on the edges of the rocks, really close to where the original light source is, and it's also going to go on the reflective surfaces. Now we want to punch up the shadows. We want to make sure that everything that is in shadow really appears to be in shadow and punch up that contrast between our light source and where our shadows are. So I'm going to take a black glaze and glaze it over everywhere where the light is not shining. And now we're just going to finish off the lake bed and all of its various attributes. I'm going to do a quick paint job on the body and then add a little bit of a blue filter to everything just so it has that appearance and ambiance of being underwater. And then we'll add a few rocks, some grass tufts, and we'll be ready to pour resin. Now for the resin pour. This was our very first resin pour, and boy did we learn a lot from it. We started with making a dam around the front of the miniature where we were going to pour the resin. We used some plastic and some hot glue. Now hot glue turned out not to be the greatest choice for this because we used a hair dryer to try to pop some of the bubbles, and it wound up that it was going to get too hot and melt the glue, and then we're going to have resin everywhere. So we didn't wind up getting all of the bubbles popped out of the resin, so it has quite a few bubbles in it, but I think it kind of adds to the ambiance of the whole thing. So Brian mixed up the resin and added a turquoise resin dye just to give it that ambiance and that look of frozen lake water. Now we didn't have any pipettes, so he used an old medicine syringe to kind of pipette the resin into the area that we needed it in. And now for the cracked ice effect. Brian took some old plastic out of one of those cheap plastic so that it would have this nice gloss on top of each other so that Brian took the plastic out of one of those old cheap plastic picture frames and broke it into little pieces and super glued those together so that it would have that nice frosted frozen effect.
It's about time.
Then he waited for the resin to set up just a little bit so that it would have a nice surface tension. And then he placed those pieces on top so that they would be floating on the water like broken off chunks of ice. My husband then took Valhalla Blizzard to create the snow effects. He made sure to put snow in areas that it would naturally accumulate and leave it off the areas where the OSL is so that it would look like it had melted from the heat of the axe. So I want to thank you guys for making it this far with us. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any future content. But without further ado, let's cue that dramatic music.